very interesting content here. We added two amazing investors in this panel as well. So as advertised in our agenda, we'd like to talk about how VCs can help to build impact companies. This panel is quite special. We have two very important guests outside of California. And also we have two amazing investors locally. So I would like to actually invite our guest, especially Jeremy, who from World Bank. How many of you are familiar with the World Bank? Raise your hand. Okay, that's actually more than I thought. Okay, how about national labs, especially Argonne national labs? Okay, you have less fans here, so there's some good undeveloped market here. So maybe I'll ask Jeremy to talk a little bit more about World Bank, especially what are the opportunities for our local investor as well as the entrepreneur community to work together with World Bank, which is a very big organization.
Thank you. Thanks very much, David. I feel like this is the Oscars. We've got this countdown clock in front of us, so I'm going to speak very quickly. But look, I'm really, proud to be here to talk a bit about the World Bank Group, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to carry on the tone that you just heard from Vitaly. We are facing huge global challenges, seemingly intractable challenges around climate, around refugees, pandemics that Vitaly mentioned, environmental challenges. And the World Bank Group is a multilateral organization. We have 189 member countries, and our two goals are ending extreme poverty. More than around a billion people live on less than $1.90 a day. Ending extreme poverty and boosting share prosperity, which is essentially tackling inequality, raising the incomes of the bottom 40%. Now, that's all very interesting, you might think, but what does it have to do with me? The answer is that increasingly, the World Bank Group and the multilateral system you've just heard from the UN is working and seeing the private sector and the investment community as key, crucial partners in tackling the world's biggest problems. And there are numerous examples, and you will hear some from our panel, I won't go into lots of details now, where we can work together, where we can partner in all sorts of ways as, in joint ventures, through data, knowledge, through the convening and the power that the World Bank institution can bring in its relationships with all of these governments around the world to help scale your ideas of impact. Within this room and within your community, there are dozens of hundreds of ideas that can transform the lives of the world's poorest people, transform economies, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Next one, Steve, and the National Lab looks like maybe you can do some advertisement about how National Lab can help our entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley.
So now it works. So my name is Steve Stevanovich. I run an investment firm, which I started about 20 years ago, and we currently manage about $2.6 billion in mostly early-stage venture capital stage companies. And I also happen to be on the board of governors of Argonne National Labs. And what I'm going to talk about today is going to be true generally for the national labs, but also specifically Argonne National Labs. And there are a number of different ways that both VCs as well as early stage venture capital stage companies can work with Argonne and the national labs. And it can be everything from, for example, utilizing lab equipment. For example, if you need a supercomputer in whatever you're doing, rather than raising money for your own, you can utilize Argonne supercomputer. You can have technology validation, for example. The labs can also help introduce companies to potential joint venture partners. They can also help them raise money as well. And once we get a little further on the panel, I'd like to give maybe an example or two.
Okay, great. We also have two amazing investors just added very late. So both of them had long experience investing in impact companies. I would like to have them do a quick introduction. Laird?
Hi, Laird Kagan with Kagan McAfee Capital Partners. We've been investing for about 25 years. We're not an impact fund per se, but we've done a lot of things that have a deep social responsibility. We were early investors in creating the corn ethanol industry, which is really a predecessor for advanced technologies. It's moving into cellulosic, which is not in the food category, but takes the wood or the corn stalk, if you will, instead of the corn, and creating a liquid fuel. We have biofuels in India. We have a financial inclusion product, which is a mobile payments business that goes to the billion people or 600 million people in India that don't have a bank account and gives them a mobile payment strategy. And a number of other products for preserving the rainforests. And so we've been involved deeply in this. Be glad to talk more about it. Thanks.
It's good to be here again. I was lucky to be a part of an earlier panel this morning, so I won't go into too much detail. But 1955 Capital is very proud to be on the stage with this group of folks because at Milken, I was lucky to meet the CEO of World Bank, and when he gave his presentation, a bunch of folks turned to me at the table and said, you know, Jay's presentation, there's a lot of slides that look a lot like what you guys have. So there's a lot of commonality. And it's because 1955 Capital is focused on investing in technologies from the US, Europe, from Israel, that have the ability to really solve some of the great challenges of the developing world in areas like energy and environment, food and agriculture, health, education. The idea is that there are a lot of amazing technologists and entrepreneurs in the developed world that are working with groups like Argonne National Labs and the major universities here to really try to develop these great technologies. But there is this survival-driven demand in the developing world that really could be a place to commercialize that technology and fund them to prime time. So that's really the idea behind what 1955 Capital is doing.
Okay, great. So one of the reasons we collaborate with United Nations is that to use the venture capital model to help some of the companies who are also benefit, we call the 1 billion people. Of course, United Nations has many different objectives, funds, grants. So most VCs are financial return driven. So maybe I'll ask our guests, especially start with Steve, that where do you see the overlap between VCs and also in general helping this world?
So the focus of the national labs is obviously focused on the U.S. However, there is a global benefit to what the national labs do. And so I think the best way is to maybe provide a recent example of a way that Argonne in particular has helped sort of an early stage company move forward. So there's a company called Alternative Petroleum Technologies, or APT, and they have patents on a way to remove sulfur from oil that is a cheaper way and cleaner way to do so than is currently done globally at refineries. So it's one of our portfolio companies. We introduced them to British Petroleum and a number of other large oil companies, and they were basically told that, you know, this sounds interesting, but we'd like to see big commercial desulfurization unit in operation first. So, of course, that takes millions of dollars and some time as well. So we introduced the company. The company went to a number of investors. The investors weren't sure whether the technology actually worked or not. So we then went to Argonne National Lab. The National Lab basically validated the technology. They independently went ahead and followed the recipe, and they basically did this on diesel fuel, jet fuel, kerosene, and issued a report basically stating that the technology worked as advertised. The company, based on this report, was then able to raise the millions of dollars that it needed for the desulfurization units, which are basically coming online as we speak. And then besides that, the large oil company from which Oregon needed to get the high sulfur fuel in order to desulfurize has also contacted Argonne and said, don't forget about your friends here. We're interested in this technology as well. Argonne said, well, it's not ours. It belongs to this company called APT. They made the introduction, and APT now is in talks with this oil company about moving things forward. So if it hadn't been for the National Lab, the company really wouldn't have made the progress that it did. And I would encourage everyone, the National Labs have fairly in-depth websites that really detail the various ways that companies can work with the National Labs. And of course, I'm happy to make introductions to people as well.
Okay, Jeremy, same question for you, but I'd like to make a little bit more broader that, for instance, how many % of the involvement World Bank did was in relationship of their potential impact to this world?
Sure. So for those of you not familiar, with the World Bank Group, we have a private sector arm which is called the IFC International Finance Corporation. That makes around $20 billion a year of investments for impact. Many of those partnerships, joint ventures, equity stakes, and that is probably the institution you're most familiar with. The World Bank Group altogether makes about $65 billion worth of loans, grants, and investments in development work. I was pleased to speak to one of your participants just sitting here today, who's a friend of his had received an early stage investment in ophthalmology eye care business, which is now a global business working in many sort of developing countries, and that can be a great example of the model. We heard a bit about financial inclusion. So we work across every single area of development: transport, healthcare, agriculture, agribusiness, energy, water, sanitation. So almost every single area that you can imagine, the way that governments communicate. Financial inclusion is very important in all aspects of ICT. So I would certainly encourage, off the back of this, because this is such a short opportunity, to have a look, to educate yourselves as far as possible around the opportunities, because there are dozens or hundreds of ways that we partner and collaborate. The other area that the World Bank Group works on is the policy and regulatory environment. You heard a little bit about that from Vitaly. We work very closely with governments around the world to create an environment to encourage entrepreneurship, to support investment and innovation. So we work at that level as well as at the more granular level of particular projects and particular work as well. So there are dozens of entry points to the bank and to the IFC, and I'd really encourage you to sort of understand that landscape.
Great. Let me ask our local investors talk about their perspective of VC fundable companies, but also can impact this world.
Well, obviously, the markets that we're talking about here are massive, multi-trillion-dollar marketplaces, so it's a great opportunity for VC investment, but it has to have a return on investment. We're looking for returns. We're not, and like the national labs and the kinds of things that governments do around the world, they can take the risk, they can create the basic research, and then hopefully that we're in a position to take that research and turn it into big markets. One of the other companies that I'm involved in is in the water space. They do desalination and industrial wastewater remediation, and they're a very low energy approach to that. They're about a third of the energy of the traditional methods. So these tech transfers, I think, are very important, and I think and the innovation centers can interface with these. It's a big challenge to get all the information going, but certainly we look for that and think that that's a great partnership that needs to continue moving forward around the world.
Yeah, just to echo the comment about financial return being important, I think often when the word impact is used, there's a certain connotation that the press and financial world tends to put around it that might be a bit negative around the sustainability of such a model. In our world, we believe very much that in order for impact investing to be successful, you need to have a path towards a very lucrative and financially oriented outcome for several reasons. I think the first is being able to attract the right team of exceptional investors. When we put our team together, we wanted to compete with all the top firms to be able to get the best investors together. I was formerly a general partner at Coastal Ventures for 5 years, and we very much use that challenge of difficulties getting corporate investors to come in, the government to support what you're doing, and when a lot of the VCs pulled back because the returns weren't quite fruitful, many of the entrepreneurs that were developing companies out of the national labs had difficulty getting across that proverbial valley of death. So we felt the solution was you have to have a global mindset, not just a US-centric mindset in looking at these problems. And so if you look at a certain type of battery technology or a solar technology, LED, energy efficiency, or something in sustainable agriculture, one model might be to look at that technology and using a global context, figure out where is this technology needed the most? Where is there a survival-driven demand that creates a lot of corporate momentum behind supporting it, government support around it, a lot of funding, a lot of capital and land that can be thrown against that problem. And very quickly, you find that many of the impact-oriented technologies could have an important home in China, where the air pollution issues and water pollution issues are very well documented, where there is significant government momentum around supporting these impact-oriented technologies. And so we very much believe that the way that you reinvent the VC model to support these types of impact-oriented investments is by having that kind of mindset.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I was going to follow up this question about global.
Could I just say, yes. I just wanted to support that because I think it's absolutely right. The ability, partnering with a group like the World Bank Group to really scale and to see those opportunities, those global opportunities to scale, to work with governments, is a key part of what we see as our added value, and absolutely, where our interests align perfectly.
Okay, Jeremy, so maybe I just want to follow up this question with you a little bit more deeper. Silicon Valley is we call the capital of the venture capitalist. So venture capitalists, so far, most of their investment are Silicon Valley. There's only a few satellite locations in North America has lots of venture capital investment. But for impact companies, many of the needed markets are actually in Africa, in Latin America. Do you want to put more effort to help Silicon Valley VCs or invite all entrepreneurs to go global, or do you want to put more effort to help these entrepreneurs in Latin America, in Africa to grow?
Yeah, so the latter. So certainly, a big part of our work is supporting the entrepreneurial infrastructure, if you like, globally, taking lessons in one place, and certainly the US and Silicon Valley, has a lot of lessons, for building that ecosystem around the world, and encouraging and supporting that. So how do we shape the policy environments? We're about to launch a Doing Business report. It's one of the World Bank's most popular reports, which ranks countries around the world in the ease of starting and growing and attracting funding for businesses. It's something that's very keenly watched by governments around the world, who are very keen to rise up the rankings, as much as they can. That's one of the examples of the ways that we can really promote entrepreneurialism and create these environments for these ideas to surface around the world. But where we're sitting today, here in Silicon Valley, there are incredible examples. There's incredible leadership, which can sort of spread to other parts of the world.
Okay, great. So maybe a follow-up question for Jeremy. Okay, for many developing countries, their infrastructure of venture capital investment actually not well developed. Very difficult for them to really build the ecosystem on their own. Where do you think local VCs in Sandkill can help in those developing countries? Maybe some with a team up with World Bank?
Yes, absolutely. So one of our new strategies is called creating markets, and it's very much this idea of understanding the limitations of within many of the developing countries, and how do we create markets in those countries in individual sectors and more broadly. So partnering here with venture capitalists, partnering with the private sector to build that capacity, build government capacity and build economic capacity in a lot of our developing countries is a key part of what we're trying to do. So, we're looking for ideas, we're looking for partnership, and certainly through the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, that's becoming an increasing part of our work. The final thing I would like to say is that we're about to adopt a new strategy which is called Maximizing Finance for Development. It's something that we're doing with all of the multilateral development banks across the entire global system of multilateral development banks. And the idea behind it is going, we call it from billions to trillions. We understand that it's going to take trillions of dollars to address and solve the world's biggest challenges that we started talking about. And that funding and that resource will need to come from the private sector. So we are going to be emphasizing putting the private sector and investment first and using public sector money only as the absolute last case solution. So our doors are now open. We are working very hard across our institution and across our institutions within the system to understand how to work better with you and more closely with you, and there's tremendous partnership opportunities there.
Great, Jeremy. Steve, maybe from National Lab standpoint, where do you think you want us to help?
Sure. So one of the ways that Argonne is involved is with venture capital accelerators. So, for example, the University of Chicago runs the largest one in the Midwest called the Polsky Center. Argonne National Lab, Fermilab, which is also run by University of Chicago, is also involved. And the Polsky Center is also working with accelerators in other countries as well. So that's another way via accelerators to also get involved with the national labs globally.
Great. Now I'd like to invite our two investors to give their final thoughts.
I don't have an immediate thought.
I guess if I were to leave folks with a view here, this is an absolutely critical area that investors need to consider. I think notwithstanding the issues we talked about related to China, you could talk about the same type of issues in India, a lot of infrastructure issues in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East and Africa. A lot of the technologies that we take for granted and the resources that we enjoy plentifully here need to be deployed to 7 billion people around the world. And we need to find different ways to do that kind of tech transfer, and it requires talent, it requires innovation and entrepreneurship, as well as funding. So I think the order of the day for all of us is to think about how we can reinvent the way that we start companies or fund companies so that we can support that grand mission.
And I guess I'd like to close with Jeremy's comment. These are large trillion-dollar markets. They're talking about $1 trillion of infrastructure investment. The people in this room are probably more looking at seed capital, early stage. So it's sort of daunting to go from here to there. But I would point back to the example of the company that I'm involved in India, which has probably had about $30 million invested and does mobile payments in the India marketplace for the unbanked population. So we're looking at a 600 million person population. The government is behind financial inclusion. There are ways to work with the UN and others to help promote that, but it comes from a technology that is not expensive to develop, and these are big, big markets. So there are opportunities for technology solutions that then can scale up and address these big markets.
Rich, last, I just want to remind all of you that United Nations, World Bank, and the National Labs came to F50's Global Capital Summit to explore a possibility to work with all of you. So if you have some ideas, solutions which meet their general guideline, please go ahead and reach out. Let's give a big, big hand to our